On a fog-soaked Halloween night in London, a clock begins to whisper inside a locked museum, and before dawn, a man is dead in an impossible room. Where are you listening from? Tell me in the comment. The rain came down in slow silver needles that hissed against the pavement, soaking the gaslit square before St. Martin's Church. It was Halloween night. Fog smothered London's rooftops, and somewhere beyond the drab facades, a clock was striking 12. The sound carried oddly, hollow and wavering, as though the air itself shivered with each note. At the far end of the square stood a small, private museum, the Ellery House of Antiquities, a narrow Georgian structure with shuttered windows and the faint gleam of brass plaques by the door. At precisely midnight, a cry rang out from its upper floor, sharp and dreadful. Then silence. By the time the caretaker forced his way inside, the impossible had already occurred. Inside the locked curator's office, its door bolted from within and the single window sealed tight against the rain, Professor Andrew Gillingham lay dead beside his desk. His skull had been struck by a heavy brass ornament from the mantel. Yet the room bore no trace of intrusion. The key was in his pocket. No one could have entered, no one could have escaped, and yet murder had been done. When Superintendent Hadley of Scotland Yard was summoned, he found the scene as baffling as it was grotesque. The carpet was undisturbed, the window's paint unbroken, the lock flawless. Outside, wet cobblestones gleamed under the street lamps, unmarked save for the constable's boots. And still, as Hadley stood there frowning under his umbrella, the faint chime of that accursed clock echoed again, though it stood unwound and silent on the curator's shelf. I was there by a stroke of misfortune or of providence, depending on one's faith in coincidence. As a visiting journalist from the Times, I had been interviewing Professor Gillingham earlier that very evening regarding the museum's upcoming Halloween Curiosities exhibition, a collection of relics and clocks reputed to be cursed or haunted. He had laughed at such talk. A mild, reedy man who preferred logic to legends. Superstition, he told me, is merely bad arithmetic. People add ghosts where they subtract reason. And now, reason itself seemed absent from this room. By morning, I was at Dr. Gideon Fell's house on Hampstead Heath, drawn there by Hadley's summons and by an overpowering sense that only one man in London could untangle such a web. The great scholar detective sat in his armchair, an enormous, shambling figure amid books, pipes, and empty tankards. His red face shone with good humor. His eyes twinkled like those of a mischievous cherub behind thick spectacles. "My dear Hadley," he boomed, his voice filling the room like a cathedral bell. "You bring me an excellent problem. A murder that ought to be impossible, yet it isn't, of course. Nothing ever is." He thumped his cane on the floor, leaned forward, and regarded us both with glee. "You say the door was bolted, the window painted shut, the key in the dead man's pocket, and a clock that chimed of its own accord. Splendid. You see, gentlemen, this is not the first time an inanimate object has spoken at the moment of murder." "What do you mean?" I asked. Dr. Fell wagged a finger, puffing contentedly at his pipe. "There was a case in Prague. 80 years ago, a violin that played itself in a locked room. In truth, it was a matter of air currents, not apparitions. Remember that, my boy. When you hear something uncanny, think first of physics before phantoms." He chuckled, eyes half closed. "Now tell me everything, every absurd, contradictory, beautifully impossible detail. Then we shall see whether your whispering clock is a ghost or merely a guilty conscience that ticks too loudly." As the fire crackled, the rain intensified outside, and somewhere far off, a clock began to chime again. I could have sworn for the briefest instant it was whispering our names. Hadley's motorcar took us through a skein of mist that turned the lamps to moons and the paving stones to wet slate. The Ellery House of Antiquities stood narrow and dark among its terraces, its brass nameplate beaded with rain, its portico wrapped in a melancholy hush. Inside, the caretaker, a heavy-shouldered man named Rook with cuffs still damp from his early ordeal, led us up to the first-floor landing, where the corridor narrowed and the paneling seemed to squeeze the breath from one's chest. We paused at the office door while he recounted his tale with a bulldog's stubbornness. The cry at midnight, the assault on the door, his failure to break it, and at last the constable fetched from the square to witness the panels splintered in. The bolt, he swore, had been shot. The key to the Yale, what they had installed some years ago, was found in the dead man's waistcoat pocket. The window was sealed, the paint unbroken. Nobody had gone in or out. He bristled, as though the impossibility were an insult personally hurled at him. Dr. Fell, panting mildly from the stairs, beamed at the door as if it were an old friend. Note. Hadley, he murmured, touching the torn jamb with the ferrule of his cane, where the splintering starts. Not at the latch, which would be natural to strike, but at the stile. Here, where a sharp blow would shove the bolt's receiver aside. That suggests impatience, not calculation. He sniffed, then bent with alarming agility for so vast a figure. Smell of walnut oil. Someone has been at the woodwork recently, and here the dust on the escutcheon. 2 arcs wiped, one narrow, one broader. We shall keep that in mind. We entered. The office was a long, plain room with a black-green hearth rug and a coal grate grudging out a low heat. Bookcases lined one wall. The window opposite, a sash with flaking white paint, was overlaid by shutters secured with a single bar. On the mantel sat the brass ornament, a Romanesque figure with a square plinth now wrapped in a policeman's cloth, but with an ugly shadow on the Persian carpet where Professor Gillingham had fallen. The big clock that gave the room its queer name, a French carriage clock with a porcelain face and a faint crack from the XI to the minute track, stood to one side under a glass dome. I felt a shiver. It looked harmless and self-contained, yet I could not forget that unearthly chiming which had seemed to wander in the fog and vibrate the very air. A young woman waited by the desk. Miss Lydia Marsh, the professor's niece and assistant, pale and steady, her hair pinned sternly back. She answered Hadley's questions in a voice that neither trembled nor challenged, which somehow made it the more compelling. She had left her uncle at 10 o'clock after finishing the exhibition labels. He had insisted on working late, to settle the caption for the whispering clock, which he said must be exactly right to kill superstition rather than feed it. They were to unveil the Halloween curios next evening. She had not a key to the office, only her uncle and Mr. Vale, a trustee, possessed them, while the caretaker held the outside keys. The window had been painted months ago after a draught set the old registers wheezing in the night. Uncle detested a draught, she said. Anything that made a queer sound was a personal enemy. Ah, rumbled Fell, twinkling. You don't know the half of it, my dear. A draught is the most obliging murderer's accomplice in the world. He made a casual-seeming circuit of the carpet, peered at the skirting board, then stopped before the carriage clock. He lifted the dome with immense gentleness, held it to the light, and laughed in his chest. Hadley, put your hand over the bell of this little demon and tell me what you feel. Hadley, with a suspicious look, did as he was told. Cold metal, nothing more. Yet, look at the hammerhead, not a fingerprint. Bless you, nobody should expect miracles but a smear that is not dust. Grease from a finger? No, this shine is harder. It will prove to be candle wax or polish. Eh? Fell leaned closer, until his spectacles all but kissed the face, and the rack and snail are set to 12, though the mainspring is run down. How, then, does an unwound clock find a voice? Mr. Percy Vale arrived in a swirl of a dark overcoat and importance. He was a narrow-jawed gentleman with a clipped moustache and a habit of tapping his cigarette case against his palm before speaking. His distress seemed real, but he managed to direct it into complaints about the press, the city, and the danger to the museum's reputation. He had parted from Gillingham after the board meeting at 9:30, he said, leaving him in high spirits. He was absurdly excited about his little display, poor fellow. Vale had no knowledge of any threats. However, Dr. Severin Lorimer, a rival horologist who had accused the museum of exhibiting a spurious 17th-century automaton, had been seen arguing with Gillingham last week. "The man's a crank," Vale sniffed. "A clever crank, but poisonous." "Every crank," Fell observed, "is a clock that strikes the hour he prefers." He asked mildly whether the board had insured the exhibition. Vale stiffened and said they had. The value was considerable. "Then we mustn't lose our heads. When people do, they notice only the thunder and miss the very small breeze that started it." Fell crouched no other word for how that bulk folded and examined the bolt. "This is an English night latch on the lock, snibbed from within. But the bolt above is a simple surface bolt, paint spattered and stiff. It has been shot. See the thin crescent at its edge? A chip bright as a tooth. Something hard struck it, and recently. Note also the little drift of paint dust below, like blue snow." He straightened with a grunt and moved to the window. "Paint sealed at the meeting rail. True enough, yet the left cord is parted, and the sash weight. Hadley, will you oblige and wrap the skirting board beneath? Do you hear that?" A hollow resonance came back, as though from a narrow shaft. "A weight box," Hadley said. "And a very pretty-sounding box, too," Fell murmured. "Imagine air being pulled through there at speed. Imagine a reed set across it. What would you get, my boy?" "A whistle," I said, startled at my own voice. The great man beamed. "Not bad, but remember that we heard a clock, not a whistle. Still, timbres can be deceiving when they bounce. Sight lies, so does sound. We shall not hang any man by echoes." He paced to the mantel. The cloth-shrouded bronze sat squat and sullen. On the shelf behind it was a paler rectangle of wood, as though a heavier dust had been lifted recently. "This ornament commonly sits an inch to the right," Fell said, "and was shifted, perhaps with unsteady hands, last night." He tapped the grate. Ashes grey, but a faint warmth still coiled in them. "Fire late, yet the coal scuttle is almost full. Our victim disliked waste. Why the extravagance?" Miss Marsh's composure flickered. "There was a chill yesterday. Uncle said the fog crept under the sill." "Did he?" "Now." Fell's eyes brightened. He stooped again by the keyhole. "Hadley, lend me your handkerchief." He pressed the cloth lightly against the hole and drew it away. A film of fine black grit showed like pepper. Soot in the keyhole. Not from the grate, from a small cord or thread that has kissed the floor, the hearth, and something less clean. "Rook, did you sweep here since last night?" "No, sir, not since yesterday afternoon." "Good." Fell looked pleased, as though the room had answered a private question. He closed the clock's glass gently, set the dome back, and stumped to the door. "We will want Dr. Lorimer before long, and we must see the labels for this exhibition, especially the one about the carriage clock. But for the moment I ask a favor. We shall douse the lights, shut the door, and stand very still. The fog is dropping. The square is quiet. If the house wishes to speak, it will speak now, and we must learn what language it uses." We obeyed, grudgingly in Hadley's case, and the caretaker muttered under his breath that he'd had enough of listening for voices in the walls. We closed the splintered door as best we could. Darkness pressed like velvet. Outside, the rain thinned to a faint hiss. In the blackness, the room seemed to grow larger and colder, as though it had slipped sideways. Then, from somewhere between the skirting board and the window, there came a small, confused stir of air. A long, breathy note rose, wavered, broke into 3 delicate pulses. 12 strokes drifted behind it. Not from the little carriage clock before us, but God help me from all around, as if the night itself had found a tongue and was counting. I felt the hair rise on my wrists. Dr. Fell, very softly, sighed like a man who has seen his quarry stir in the bush. "Thank you," he said into the darkness. "That will do beautifully." The sound died as if swallowed by the fog itself, leaving us standing in black silence, broken only by the faint rasp of Hadley's breath. Then Dr. Fell's match flared, revealing his face a ruddy moon above the wavering flame, and the immense calm in his eyes made the room seem smaller, more ordinary, though the echo of that phantom chime still lingered in my nerves. "There now," he murmured, puffing the match out and drawing on his pipe. "We've heard our ghost, and it's a mechanical one. Note the intervals: Hadley 3 pulses, not 4, uneven spacing, and no resonance from the mantle. It came from lower down, near the wall cavity." "Excellent." Hadley frowned. "Excellent. It's devilish, Fell. Something in this house makes a noise that shouldn't exist, and a man's dead for it." "Quite so," Fell said, booming contentment rising again. "And when we know what caused that noise, we'll know who took advantage of it." He turned to Miss Marsh, who was gripping the back of a chair with both hands. "My dear young lady, you said your uncle disliked odd sounds. Did he ever complain about that one?" She nodded slowly. "2 nights ago. He said the old sash weights whined when the fog grew thick. He thought it was air pressure. He meant to have Rook mend the cords." "Air pressure again," Fell echoed. "The world is run on it, and murderers too." He thumped his cane and signaled for the lamps. "Let's restore order, eh? I detest stage ghosts that forget their cues." As the lights flickered back, Hadley busied himself questioning Rook and Vale again, but Fell drifted around the office like a restless bear, his gaze roving from floorboards to shelves. He paused before the hearth and prodded the coal with his cane tip. Still warm, you see. The fire burned past midnight, and the good professor's chair pulled an inch to the left, away from the draught. He stooped, squinting. The draught that came from where? Precisely. He gestured for me to fetch the paper scraps from beneath the grate. They were half-charred, fragments of typed text. By candlelight we read a few phrases. Public deception. Forged restoration. Vale implicated. Then the rest was ashes. Hadley's brows shot up. "Forgery? Are you telling me Gillingham had discovered the board's precious automaton was fake?" Vale blanched, stepping forward. "That's ridiculous." He said nothing of the kind. He was overworked, likely scribbling some nonsense to himself. Dr. Fell's expression was all mild benevolence. Nonsense, perhaps. But nonsense makes men nervous. "Tell me, Mr. Vale, did you visit this room last evening after the board meeting?" "Certainly not," Vale snapped. "I went straight home." "Ah, home," Fell murmured. "A fine alibi, especially when the clock strikes midnight without asking your leave. But I wonder if a man had wanted to make this office appear haunted, to frighten a superstitious scholar, he might tamper with the very thing he despised. The sound of the whispering clock. A bit of wire through the keyhole, perhaps, tied to the sash cavity where the air moans. A small tug from outside, and presto, a spectral chime. Perfect to lure him near the mantel, wouldn't you say?" Hadley stared. "Are you suggesting someone frightened him to death?" "Not quite. Our professor was struck, not scared. But fright may have drawn him into position." Fell turned his cane in his hands like a pointer. The blow came from behind, with the figure lifted by a right-handed man shorter than Gillingham. The swing was awkward, sideways. Not Rook too tall. Not our friend Vale unless he stooped very low. But perhaps someone smaller, nervous, desperate, who waited until Gillingham leaned close to listen for the ghost he thought he'd disproved. Miss Marsh's composure cracked at that, her voice trembling. "Doctor, Fell, you can't mean—" "I mean nothing yet," he said gently, "except that ghosts, when cornered, have human hands." Hadley scowled. "Then we'll question this, Dr. Lorimer. If anyone had a grudge, by all means," Fell interrupted. "Invite him to tea. Tell him we've found something curious in the keyhole and the clock's bell, and that I've discovered how to make it speak again." His smile turned impish. "If he's guilty, that should draw him faster than a tune draws rats." Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. As we stepped into the corridor, I heard that faint moan again, distant now, threading through the walls like breath through a flute. Fell paused on the landing, listening. Hear that, my boy? The house is restless. It doesn't like lies. Tomorrow, when we come back in daylight, it will tell us everything. Hadley grunted. You talk as if the building itself were a witness. Fell chuckled, descending the stairs with ponderous grace. So it is. Wood remembers strain, dust remembers touch, air remembers movement. The trick, Hadley, is to ask the right question. Tonight we've heard one answer already, and soon we'll know who asked it first. Morning crept over London like the slow lifting of a grey veil. The fog had settled into a damp, pearly stillness, muffling every sound except the occasional rattle of a milk cart in the square. When Superintendent Hadley and I arrived once again at the Ellery House of Antiquities, Dr. Gideon Fell was already there. His broad figure outlined against the window, his cape dripping faintly onto the tiles. He looked almost cheerful, as though he had spent the night in good company with his thoughts and a pipe. "Good morning, gentlemen," he greeted, his voice booming like a church bell in the quiet hall. "I trust you've breakfasted? Splendid. The day promises to be most instructive." He raised his cane toward the stair. "Our whispering friend in the wall has spoken again. The caretaker reports the same sound shortly after dawn." Hadley frowned. "Then that settles it. Someone's still in the building." "Not so fast," Fell chuckled. "Ghosts of sound can linger long after their creators are gone. Let us not arrest the architecture before we understand it." We climbed to the curator's office again, now cleared of its dreadful occupant. The constables had sealed off the area, and the morning light revealed details the lamplight had disguised. The painted window looked dull. Yet near the sill, Fell's finger traced faint streaks where condensation had run down, through broken paint lines. "Our sash," he said, "has been touched since the storm began. But by whom, and from which side?" He produced from his coat pocket a length of fine wire, newly kinked, its end smudged with soot, found by the charred grate this morning. About the same gauge used to suspend small museum exhibits. "What might one do with such a thing, Hadley?" "Pull something through the keyhole," the superintendent muttered. "Like you said last night, a trick with air or sound." "Precisely," Fell said. "But there's artistry here. The murderer didn't merely tug a wire, he used the house itself as an instrument. Think of it as a flute. The sash cavity as the pipe, the gap under the door as the mouthpiece. One pull, one gust, and the air hums, creating the illusion of a chiming clock." He rapped the floorboards with his cane. "A device to lure, not to kill." The image formed vividly in my mind. Gillingham, curious and half amused, leaning to investigate the sound, his ear near the grate or wall, then the swift, unseen strike from behind. "But that still doesn't explain how the killer escaped," I said. "If the door was bolted and the window sealed." Fell's laughter filled the room, warm and wheezing. "Ah, my dear fellow, we must not assume too much about seals. Paint, you see, can crack like old varnish when forced. Observe the meeting rail here, where the putty flakes. A careful hand could pry it open just enough to slip a cord through. The real question is, did he go out that way, or merely use it to seem to go?" Before Hadley could answer, a knock sounded from the corridor. Miss Lydia Marsh entered, pale from sleeplessness but composed. She carried a small cardboard folder tied with ribbon. "You asked to see these, Dr. Fell. My uncle's label drafts for the exhibition." Fell accepted them with a smile that almost gentled his bulk. He unfolded one sheet and began to read aloud, his brows lifting. "The Whispering Clock, a French curiosity of uncertain date, said to foretell misfortune when struck by unearthly sound. The mechanism, however, obeys only natural law." Fell lowered the paper. "A man who feared superstition enough to mock it, and someone feared that mockery would reveal their fraud." Miss Marsh swallowed. "You think the murder was about the automaton?" Fell's eyes glinted. I think the automaton is only part of it. Your uncle's note hinted at a forged restoration, did it not? That means deceit, and deceit means motive. Hadley stepped forward. We'll get Lorimer in here within the hour. If anyone's been falsifying antiques, it's that rival of his. But Fell's expression was thoughtful rather than satisfied. Perhaps. Or perhaps Lorimer merely pointed out what another wished hidden. He closed the folder and tapped it against his palm. Before we see him, I must test a small theory. Rook, fetch me a candle, if you please. The caretaker obeyed, grumbling. Fell placed the candle near the hearth and lit it. The tiny flame swayed toward the keyhole, then away, as if breathing. There's our draft again, he said, a narrow passage behind the skirting leading, I suspect, to the disused servant's stair. A perfect channel for our ghostly tune. Hadley crouched. Then the killer could have used that to escape? Unlikely. It's scarcely wide enough for a cat. But through it, one could thread a wire. Fell's tone softened. Gentlemen, we are dealing not with brute strength but with delicacy. The kind of cunning that measures an inch of air and turns it into terror. He blew out the candle and turned to Miss Marsh. One more thing, my dear. Who, besides your uncle, knew of this whispering clock's reputation? She hesitated. Dr. Lorimer. And Mr. Vale. Of course, they both mocked it during the meeting. Indeed, Fell said, his voice booming, and with satisfaction. Two men who mocked the same ghost, yet one of them used it to murder. Outside, a constable's steps echoed on the stairs, followed by a brisk knock. Hadley opened the door to admit a thin man with restless hands and pince-nez gleaming like tiny mirrors. Dr. Lorimer, Fell said genially, spreading his arms. Come in, sir. We've just been discussing you and ghosts that whisper through clockwork. The newcomer froze at the words, and for one fleeting instant, I saw something fear, perhaps, or guilt flicker behind the lenses of his spectacles. Dr. Fell smiled like a man who had just heard the clock strike exactly the hour he expected. Dr. Lorimer's entrance altered the room like a sudden change in barometric pressure. He was a thin, angular man, in a dark overcoat, his hair brushed straight back from a high forehead, and his movements jerky, as though constantly on the verge of flight. His eyes flickered around the office at the scorch marks on the grate, the clock beneath its glass dome, the faint ghost of blood on the rug, and he seemed to shrink into himself before bowing stiffly. Superintendent Hadley, he said, his voice tight as wire. You sent for me regarding the tragedy. I came as soon as I received word. Tragedy, Fell rumbled. A curious choice of word for murder. Still, we have questions, and you have the air of a man who prefers to give answers. Lorimer removed his gloves, revealing long, bony fingers, stained faintly with varnish. If you mean to imply I had anything to do with Gillingham's death, I'll remind you I was home in Hammersmith by 10:30. My housekeeper will swear to it. Hadley opened his notebook. We'll verify that. For now, tell us about your quarrel with him last week. The man's lips compressed. A professional dispute, nothing more. He intended to display an automaton. I proved to be a forgery. Its mechanism, a modern insertion into a 17th century case. He refused to withdraw it. I told him publicly that his exhibition would make the museum a laughingstock. And the next morning, Fell said gently, you wrote him an apology, a most gallant gesture. Lorimer's composure faltered. How do you know that? My dear fellow, Fell chuckled, you left the carbon copy on your desk blotter. I took the liberty of glancing at it when Hadley sent a constable to fetch you. An apology can be genuine, or it can be a mask for renewed resentment. Which was yours? The man hesitated, his gaze fixed on the clock. Perhaps both. I pitied him. He was growing erratic, talking about exposing fraud within his own trustees. You'll find he made enemies enough without me. Hadley looked up sharply. What fraud? Lorimer spread his hands. He didn't confide, only hinted that the museum's finances were arranged to conceal certain payments. I assumed he meant Vale. Everyone does. The name hung in the air like a chill draft. Miss Marsh stiffened. Fell's eyes brightened. Vale? Yes. The dependable trustee with a flair for accounts. Tell me, Lorimer, this clock here, the so-called whispering clock, did you inspect it recently? I did, Lorimer said, cautious now. 2 days ago, at Gillingham's invitation, he asked me to test the chime. It was silent then, as it's been for years. Fell leaned forward, his massive frame creaking. And yet last night it spoke with a voice heard through locked doors. Would it interest you to know, sir, that the sound could be produced by a mere draught through the wall, guided by a wire? Lorimer's eyes darted toward the keyhole. A wire? Then you think it was all some trick? Trick, illusion, deceit, Fell said cheerfully. They are siblings, Doctor. But I wonder whose hand guided that wire. The craftsman's, perhaps, someone clever with mechanisms and delicate work, someone like yourself. The accusation, though softly spoken, struck like a whip. Lorimer sprang to his feet. You're mad if you think I came here to clear my name, not to listen to. Sit down, Hadley barked. But Fell raised a placid hand. No, no. Let him storm. The guilty shout too soon. The innocent wait too long. I only wanted to see his face when I mentioned wire. Lorimer glared, trembling. I've nothing to hide. I'll answer your questions, but I'll not be made a spectacle of. Excellent, Fell said, satisfied. Then perhaps you'll explain why you visited the back lane behind this house shortly before midnight. The room froze. Hadley blinked. What? I found boot impressions there this morning, Fell said softly. Fine-grained soil from the museum's garden. Size 8 your size, Dr. Lorimer, and recently made. You came back, though the museum was locked. Why? Lorimer's mouth worked soundlessly. I was walking to the station. The fog confused me. The fog may confuse sight, Fell said, but not direction. You came to see the light in this office window, didn't you? You saw Gillingham still at work, and then, perhaps, you saw someone else. For the first time, Lorimer's defiance cracked. Someone else? Yes, Fell said, his tone suddenly grave. The true murderer. You know who it is. And because you do, your life may be in danger. Lorimer sat back down slowly, his fingers gripping the chair's arms. If I told you what I suspect, he said hoarsely, you'd never believe me. Fell's eyes gleamed through the smoke. My dear sir, he said, I make a hobby of believing the unbelievable. Speak while the clock still keeps its counsel. The carriage clock ticked once, just once, and fell silent again. For a long moment, no one spoke. The faint ticking of the carriage clock filled the silence like a heartbeat in an empty church. Dr. Lorimer's eyes had gone distant, as though he were measuring the risk of every word against something unseen beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, strained, but certain. You'll call me mad. I thought so myself last night. But I swear I saw a figure in that upper window, the office after midnight. The light was gone, yet something moved, and when I approached the lane, I heard whispering. Whispering? Hadley asked, leaning forward. Like two people arguing, Lorimer said. One voice, Gillingham's, I'd have sworn sharp and frightened. The other, low, like someone forcing calm. I meant to go in. But before I reached the door, the light flared for a moment. Then everything went dark. A few seconds later, I heard that sound, the clock's chime. It came from the wall, not from within the room. I froze. Then, silence. He rubbed his temples. I left. I told myself it was imagination. Fog does dreadful things to sound. Dr. Fell, who had been puffing at his pipe as if listening to a ghost recite a confession, exhaled a cloud of smoke that hung in the chilly air like thought made visible. "And yet," he said, "you've kept this sighting to yourself until now." "Not very scientific, my dear fellow." Lorimer gave a bitter laugh. "Would you have believed me? 2 voices, a phantom chime, a light that dies and returns. I'd have been locked in a sanatorium before the yard got here." Hadley's pencil scratched across his notebook. "You say Gillingham was afraid. Why?" "He'd been acting oddly for days," Lorimer said. "He told me someone had been tampering with the exhibits, moving things a fraction of an inch, switching labels. He suspected Vale, but had no proof. He said he'd found evidence in the trustees' accounts and was going to reveal it at the exhibition's opening." Fell's round eyes gleamed behind his spectacles. "Ah yes, the unveiling of ghosts, literal and financial." He turned toward Miss Marsh, who had been standing rigid near the window. "My dear, did your uncle ever mention such tampering to you?" She nodded reluctantly. "Yes, he said the whispering clock had been wound somehow, though he'd locked the mechanism. When he showed it to me, I remember noticing fingerprints on the dome, none of them his. He had very dry hands." "Fingerprints," Fell repeated softly, "and a mechanism wound though unwound the day before. That's excellent. It tells us not who killed him, but when the trap was set." Hadley glanced up. Meaning the killer prepared the illusion earlier," Fell said. "The wire, the draft, those are not hurried devices. They require patience, access, and precision. Our murderer must have spent time alone in this office, knowing how the building breathed." He turned to Lorimer. "You understand machinery, Doctor. If you had wanted to create that sound, could you have done it?" Lorimer hesitated, then nodded. "In theory, yes. A thin wire through the keyhole to pull open a flap at the sash's edge would do it, but it would take testing. You'd need to know exactly how air moved through the cavity." "Precisely," Fell said with satisfaction. "Someone did test it. That faint soot on the keyhole, the chipped paint by the bolt signs of prior trials. And when the professor heard it last night, he thought the experiment spontaneous. He leaned down, curious, and was struck. The silence that followed was heavy, taut with implication. Vale's name hovered unsaid in everyone's mind. He was clever, urbane, and as trustee had ample access. Yet there was a flicker of something else in Fell's eyes, a spark of amusement, as though he saw a deeper pattern none of us yet grasped. "Hadley," he said suddenly, "I'd like you to fetch Mr. Vale at once. Tell him we've uncovered irregularities in the museum accounts. That should ensure his punctuality. In the meantime, Dr. Lorimer will remain under our friendly supervision." Lorimer half rose in alarm. "You're not arresting me?" "Good heavens, no," Fell said. "I wouldn't dream of such an indignity before I've confirmed whether your ghost was human or otherwise. For now, consider yourself, let us say, a guest in this haunted house." Hadley departed with 2 constables. The rest of us remained. The room thick with the faint scent of candle, smoke, and polish. Fell busied himself examining the carpet once more, then knelt heavily beside the baseboard near the window. His fingers brushed along the crack, then stopped. Ha! Dust displaced, yet only in a straight line, no scuff, no shoe mark. Our phantom moves delicately indeed. Miss Marsh, pale but composed, whispered, "Dr. Fell, if you truly believe my uncle was murdered over the accounts, then whoever did it must be desperate enough to kill again." Fell looked up, eyes twinkling but voice grave. "Yes, my dear, and that's why, before this day ends, we shall invite our murderer to perform his own trick once more. But this time, the clock will whisper truth instead of lies." The faint chime from the clock, struck by no hand, answered him with a single, hollow note as though agreeing. It was close to noon when Hadley returned, his overcoat damp with mist and his expression darker than the sky outside. Behind him strode Percy Vale, his moustache sharper than ever and his manner brisk to the point of insolence. He removed his gloves with deliberate care, letting them drop onto the desk where Gillingham had died. "Well, Superintendent," he said, "you've had me fetched here like a common thief. May I ask what melodrama I'm expected to play in now? Dr. Fell regarded him from the fireside, the lines of his broad face unreadable except for the faint twinkle in his eye. Not melodrama, my dear sir, he said pleasantly. Only truth. Though I admit, truth often comes on with a touch of the theatrical. Vale laughed thinly. You talk like the newspapers. I suppose you mean to accuse me of killing poor Gillingham next. Accuse? Fell echoed. Not at all. We're far too polite for that. But you'll forgive us if we find it curious that the man who managed the museum's accounts and who stood to lose everything from an audit should be the same man whose fingerprints were found on the clock's dome. For a second, Vale's poise faltered. Fingerprints? That's absurd. I handled it last week when Gillingham showed it to me. Last week? Yes, Fell agreed mildly. But you see, the glass was polished 2 days ago by Miss Marsh. Her uncle insisted on spotless exhibits, so any prints left before that would have been erased. Hadley's voice cut in sharply. So, Mr. Vale, you touched that clock after Tuesday, possibly on the night of the murder. Vale's eyes narrowed. If you mean I was here last night, you're wrong. I went home directly after the board meeting. Ask my driver. We already have, Hadley said. He left you at your club at 10, but you were seen later leaving by the back entrance toward the river. Care to explain? For the first time, a bead of sweat traced the fine line of Vale's temple. He drew a breath through his teeth. I had a meeting, private business, nothing to do with Gillingham. Fell rose, filling the room like a sudden storm. Private business with ghosts, perhaps. You were here, Vale. The fog was thick enough to hide you, but not thick enough to erase your shadow from the pavement. You came to silence a man who had learned too much, and when you struck him, you used his own superstition against him. Vale's composure returned, brittle and fierce. That's conjecture, Doctor. You have no proof. On the contrary, Fell said softly, I have too much of it. A wire through the keyhole smeared with wax from your brand of sealant, the same you used to patch the display cases. Footprints outside matching your shoes. And the final touch, a torn scrap of your club stationery found in the grate among the burned notes. Gillingham must have been writing to you when he died. The silence that followed was almost painful. The faint hiss of the fire seemed to grow louder, and I could hear Miss Marsh's breath quicken. Vale turned toward the window, his voice flat. You're clever, Fell. I'll grant you that. But you still haven't explained your impossible miracle. The door was bolted. The key was in his pocket. I couldn't have left the room. Fell smiled, a slow, deliberate movement that made the air itself seem to tighten. Ah, but that's where your artistry betrays you. You never left the room at all because you were never inside it. Vale spun round, his face paling. What? The blow, Fell said, was struck through the half-open window. You pried the sash just wide enough to slip the ornament from the mantle attached by a cord you'd prepared earlier. You swung it like a pendulum through the gap, timing it perfectly as Gillingham bent forward to inspect the whispering sound you'd summoned. The force was enough. Then you pulled the weapon back, reseated the window, and sealed it again with paint flakes and pressure. A locked room miracle achieved from outside. Hadley gave a low whistle. Good Lord, Fell went on, his voice now grave and steady. You set the scene with such precision that even a seasoned policeman might swear no hand could reach through. But every trick leaves a signature. The window's interior edge bore a crescent of brass polish from the plinth, invisible till morning light revealed it. And the wire that sang through the wall, your clever distraction, to draw the poor devil into the perfect line of fire. For a moment, Vale said nothing. Then he gave a strange, short laugh, the kind that sounds like a man choking on disbelief. And if I deny it? Fell lifted his cane and tapped the window frame. Then we'll open this sash in front of witnesses and demonstrate the entire performance. You'll see how the impossible becomes inevitable. Hadley stepped forward. You'd better save us the trouble, Mr. Vale. I suggest you start talking. But Vale's eyes darted not toward the door, but toward the clock. His hand twitched once, as if calculating something. Then, with a sudden movement, he snatched the brass dome from the table and hurled it against the floor. It shattered with a crash that made Miss Marsh cry out. When the echoes died, Fell's voice came slow and almost sorrowful. Only the guilty destroy what they cannot silence. The whispering clock lay in ruins, and through its fractured face I thought I heard the faintest sigh of air, like a ghost released at last. For a long instant, no one moved. The shards of the glass dome glittered across the rug like frozen rain, the sound of their fall still quivering in the silence. Then Dr. Fell drew a deep breath that whistled faintly through his teeth, and his great shoulders settled, as though some part of him pitied even now the man who stood defiant before him. "Ah," he said softly, "and there goes our last polite fiction." Vale's hands trembled, but his tone remained dry. "You'll forgive me, Doctor, but I won't stand by while you perform parlor tricks and call them proof. You can rebuild the clock, summon the ghost again if you like, but you'll never prove I killed him. Not in a court." Hadley's jaw tightened. "You've just destroyed key evidence, Vale. That won't help your cause." "Evidence?" Vale laughed bitterly. "You had a trinket and a theory. That's all." Fell regarded him gravely. "A theory, yes, but one that fits every fact as neatly as a key in a lock, and you just turned it yourself. You see, you didn't destroy a trinket. You destroyed a device that would have betrayed you twice. Once for what it contained, and again for what it lacked." The room seemed to tilt toward Fell's words. Even the constables by the door leaned in. "Contained?" Hadley repeated. "Exactly," Fell said. Inside that clock was a fragment of paint blue-gray, the same as the window frame. It proved the clock had been placed in the sash's arc when the fatal blow was struck. And what it lacked, he added, was dust upon the hammer, spring freshly oiled and polished. Only someone who had handled it within hours of the murder could have done that. No servant would dare touch the exhibits. Only Vale, the trustee, could move freely here after closing. Vale's defiance cracked then. His voice came out hoarse. "If you knew that much, why let me smash it?" Fell's smile was slow, almost weary. "Because I wanted to see whether your conscience would tremble before your vanity. You chose vanity." Hadley stepped forward. "I think we've heard enough. I dislike unfinished lectures." He turned to the rest of us, his eyes gleaming now with the fierce satisfaction of a man unveiling the final pattern. The puzzle, gentlemen, was never the murder alone. It was the noise, the so-called whisper of the clock. A clever trick, meant to draw the professor near the hearth while the killer, standing outside in the fog, worked the sash. The draft carried the vibration through the cavity, imitating a chime. When Gillingham leaned in, the weighted ornament swung down from the half-open window and struck. The bolt on the door had been drawn before. The key pocketed to complete the illusion, and when the murderer resealed the paint and left by the garden wall, he left behind a room apparently sealed from the world. He paused, puffing thoughtfully at his pipe. It was all neat. Except for one thing, air. The faintest current under the skirting betrayed the hidden vent. "Sound, gentlemen, travels faster than lies." Hadley grunted his admiration. "You make it sound like a conjurer's trick." "It was one," Fell said, turning to Vale. "And like most conjurers, our friend here mistook misdirection for safety. He meant the whispering clock to frighten Gillingham, to make his death seem a warning from beyond. But such theatrics demand precision, and precision leaves fingerprints literal and moral. He might have escaped suspicion had he not been greedy enough to retrieve the burned notes afterward. His shoe prints in the lane betrayed him." Vale's shoulders sagged. For the first time, the arrogance drained from his face, leaving only a man cornered by his own calculations. "You don't understand," he said quietly. It wasn't meant to happen that way. I only wanted to scare him, to make him withdraw the accusation. He turned suddenly when the sound started. I pulled the cord too sharply. It struck harder than I meant. Hadley's tone was flat. An accident, then? You prepared a weapon, set the stage, and called it fright. That's some accident. Vale looked at Fell, almost pleading. He was going to ruin everything. The museum would have folded, the staff dismissed. I only meant to frighten him into silence. He laughed at me, called me a coward hiding behind numbers. Then the fog rolled, the draft sang, and he was on the floor. For once, Fell's booming voice softened. And so your clock whispered death instead of fear. That is the curse of clever men. Vale, they believe they can choreograph chants. Hadley gave the order quietly. The constables stepped forward. Vale didn't resist. He seemed to have turned inward, shrinking into a silence more profound than any ghosts. As they led him out, Fell stood gazing at the broken clock, its brass innards glinting dully among the shards. Pity, he murmured. Such craftsmanship deserves a better epitaph, but in every impossible crime there's always a voice waiting to be heard. All we need do is listen. Miss Marsh, pale but steady, asked softly, "Will it ever whisper again?" Dr. Fell. He turned toward her, his eyes kind behind the misted lenses. "No, my dear. The whispering's done. But I dare say the wind outside will remember the tune for a while yet." The fire crackled, the last echo of that strange chime fading into the hush. Outside, the fog thinned, and the faint tolling of Street Martin's bells drifted through the square 12 strokes, clear and unbroken this time. The afternoon waned into a pale, reluctant dusk. Outside the museum, the fog began to lift in tatters, revealing the wet cobblestones and the black railings that gleamed like bone in the fading light. Inside, the great rooms of the Ellery house were silent again, save for the low murmur of the constables moving through their final inspection. Yet despite the arrest, despite Vale's broken composure and confession, Dr. Fell's brow remained furrowed. He sat heavily in the curator's armchair, Gillingham's chair, his cane resting across his knees, and stared at the remnants of the shattered clock as though the crime still whispered something unfinished. Hadley noticed it too. "You've got your man, Fell," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "He's admitted as much. The motive, the method all clear enough. What's gnawing at you now?" Fell's hand waved vaguely in the air. "Gnawing, yes. That's the word. I dislike endings that come too neatly wrapped. They smell of convenience." "You think he's lying?" I asked. "Not exactly lying," Fell replied, his deep voice echoing faintly in the panelled room. "But confessions are dangerous things. They can be true in outline and false in essence. Our friend Vale spoke of accident of panic, but I've been wondering about the timing. The whispering began. The blow was struck, the window resealed. But tell me, how did the clock chime again later, after Vale had fled?" Hadley frowned. "You mean the chime we heard when we entered?" "Just so," Fell said, rising with a wheeze of effort. "A mechanism triggered by air cannot perform without cause, and yet we all heard it." The vent breathed once more after the deed was done. The murderer's contraption had already been dismantled, or so we thought. Miss Marsh, who had been standing quietly by the door, looked up sharply. "Are you saying someone else was here? After the murder?" Fell turned toward her, his gaze almost kindly. "I'm saying that Vale's scheme was not his alone." That sentence dropped into the silence like a stone into a still pond. Hadley stared, half incredulous. "Good Lord. Fell, you can't mean there was another hand in it?" "Not in the killing itself," Fell said slowly, "but in the theatre that followed. Remember the fragments in the grate, the notes accusing Vale, the references to a forgery. Convenient, weren't they? Too convenient. Vale feared exposure, yes, but Gillingham never wrote those accusations down in such plain words. He was too cautious, too academic. Someone wanted that trail found and followed, wanted Vale to seem guilty beyond dispute. Hadley's brows drew together. But who would benefit by framing him? The museum's board is finished either way. Fell moved to the window, his reflection looming large and ghostly in the glass. Not quite. The museum will survive under new management. With Vale discredited, the trusteeship passes to his junior partner, a clever man, one with a reputation for reforming old institutions and for charming the public purse. You've met him, Hadley. He's been hovering at the edges all day, offering help, sympathy, and the occasional too well-timed question. Hadley's eyes narrowed. Lorimer? Fell nodded. The same. He played the role of rival too convincingly. He came to us with tales of quarrels, of financial deceit true enough to be believed, but poisoned in proportion. He told us he'd heard voices outside the museum that night, yet neglected to mention he himself had a second key to the side door, one he forgot to surrender when the police sealed the place. Miss Marsh gave a startled gasp. Dr. Lorimer? But he seemed concerned? Fell finished. Naturally. Concern is the cloak of the manipulator. He used Vale's vanity and Gillingham's integrity as his stage props. I fancy he came here after the murder, knowing Vale had fled, to ensure the evidence pointed only one way. He stoked the fire, burned what was inconvenient, and left the rest as tidy as a laboratory shelf. The second chime, my dear Hadley, was his mistake. When he opened the window to scatter the ash, the draught revived the same ghostly note. The house spoke once more and betrayed him. Hadley's jaw tightened as the truth took shape. Then Vale's confession he's covering for the man who trapped him. Exactly. A final irony. Vale believes himself guilty by accident, not realizing he was engineered into guilt by design. Fell sighed, rubbing his temple. We must act quickly. Lorimer's far too clever to wait around when he senses the tide turning. Hadley turned to the constable at the door. Get a man to the Hammersmith address now. As the officer dashed out, Fell looked around the darkening room one last time. You see, gentlemen, he said softly, the dead seldom lie. It's the living who complicate their stories. In this case, the whispering clock never meant to accuse it, merely kept time. It was the minds around it that tried to rewrite its rhythm. Outside, a carriage clattered faintly through the mist. Fell listened, his expression sharpening. That will be him, he murmured, running, as the guilty always do not, and from justice, but from their own reflection. Hadley reached for his hat. Then let's not give him too much of a head start. Fell smiled faintly, lifting his cane. Onward, then. Let's see if the last echo of this clock can still be heard in Hammersmith. The road to Hammersmith was slick with rain, the lamps smearing pale gold lines across the windscreen as Hadley's motorcar growled through the fog. I sat in the back beside Dr. Fell, whose massive frame filled the seat and whose thoughts, I could sense, filled the night itself. He had not spoken much since leaving the museum. His eyes, round and gleaming behind the spectacles, were fixed on the blurred lights beyond the glass. When he did speak at last, it was as though the words emerged from a depth of reasoning already complete. You see, my dear Hadley, he said, what fascinates me about men like Lorimer is not their cruelty but their confidence. He constructed an impossible crime to expose another man, yet he forgot the simplest truth of all, that impossibility itself is suspicious. The moment a murder appears too neat, too absolute, it begs to be untied. Hadley, his jaw set against the wheel, grunted. He'll deny everything. The moment we get there, he'll play the wronged intellectual again. We've no warrant yet, only your theory. Fell's laugh rolled like distant thunder. My dear fellow, theories are all the warrant reason requires. The rest is theatre for magistrates. He leaned back, puffing his pipe, and the glow briefly lit his face like the ember of some hidden forge. Still, I suspect our man will save us the trouble. He's clever enough to know the game's up. When we reached Lorimer's street, the air seemed colder, the fog dense as wool. The houses stood in prim, silent rows, every window dark except one, his study, a square of yellow against the grey. Hadley halted the motorcar and signalled the constables to flank the door. As we approached, Fell's cane tapped once against the pavement, a sound sharp as punctuation. Inside, the scene was calm, too calm. The fire burned low, the curtains drawn. Lorimer sat at his desk, his head bowed over a sheaf of papers, his spectacles lying beside an uncorked decanter. When he raised his eyes to us, his expression was one of faint irritation, as if we had interrupted a thought rather than an escape. "Superintendent," he said coolly. "Dr. Fell. I expected you might come. The police always prefer tidy conclusions, don't they? I suppose Vale's confession wasn't enough for you." Hadley closed the door behind us. "It was too convenient. And you, Dr. Lorimer, have been too helpful by half." Lorimer smiled without warmth. "And yet here you are, trespassing in my home." Fell stepped forward, his shadow sprawling across the carpet like a thundercloud. "Not trespassing, sir, merely calling time. Your clock ran past midnight at the Ellery house, and its echo led us here." Something flickered behind Lorimer's eyes, the faintest tremor of nerves. "You talk in riddles, Doctor." "Then allow me to clarify them," Fell said, his voice booming now. "You engineered the entire sequence. You discovered Vale's mismanagement months ago. Used it to manipulate him into preparing the mechanism, promising to expose Gillingham together. But your aim was larger. When Vale's trick worked too well. When the professor died, you turned opportunist. You entered the museum through the side door, burned the papers that tied you to the forgery, and arranged the evidence to condemn Vale utterly. You nearly succeeded. Only you forgot that air like truth cannot be sealed by paint." Hadley took a step forward. "We've enough to hold you, Lorimer. You might as well tell it straight." Lorimer's composure wavered. "You've no proof." Fell's eyes gleamed. "Oh, but we do." The window latch from the curator's office, dustless on one side, smeared on the other with varnish identical to what coats your laboratory table. And that wire we found by the grate bears a faint trace of your fingerprint beneath the soot. You used it to adjust the mechanism after Vale had fled. A scholar's precision, Doctor, but a murderer's misstep. For a moment, the fire hissed in the grate. Then Lorimer let out a dry, almost weary laugh. "You call me a murderer? No, Fell, you mistake the scholar for the scapegoat. Vale killed him. I merely ensured justice by making it known." "You ensured survival," Fell said gently. "But you forgot that survival at the expense of truth is the worst death of all." They moved forward, but Lorimer suddenly turned toward the desk, his hand darting toward the decanter. Fell's cane came down with surprising speed, striking the glass from his grasp. The bottle shattered, spilling not whiskey but a glinting scatter of crushed tablets into the rug. Fell's voice was quiet now. "Poison, of course. The coward's epilogue. But not tonight, my friend. You'll live to explain your science to a jury." Lorimer slumped back in his chair, all strength gone. The room's stillness deepened as though the walls themselves held their breath. Outside, the fog pressed close to the windows, and in its thickness, I fancied I heard only once the faint whispering of wind through a hollow space, the echo of the crime that had begun it all. As we left, Fell paused at the door, turning once more to the room. "It's strange," he murmured. "They all wanted the clock to speak, to confess, to warn, to absolve. But in the end, it only told the time. And that," he added, looking at his watch, "was precisely 11 minutes past reason." Hadley gave a dry smile. "You mean past midnight, surely?" Fell's eyes twinkled. "No, my boy, past reason. The hour when men believe they can bend truth and not be broken by it." Outside, the rain had ceased, and the last of the fog was lifting. Somewhere far off, the bells of street martins began to toll again, steady, human, and real. The hours that followed blurred into a long procession of procedure and quiet exhaustion. Lorimer was taken away without further struggle, his gaunt figure vanishing into the fog like a shadow returning to its own kind. Hadley gave the necessary orders, the constables gathered the evidence, and by the time we returned to the Ellery House of Antiquities, the first hint of dawn had begun to press faint silver through the thinning mist. The square lay empty and glistening, as though the whole city were holding its breath after a nightmare. Inside, the museum felt different, emptied of menace, yet oddly hollow. The smell of dust and varnish mingled with the faint metallic tang of rain that drifted in through a cracked window. I followed Dr. Fell through the curator's office, now stripped of its police markers. The fragments of the whispering clock had been swept into a small wooden box on the desk, the broken porcelain face glinting faintly beneath its lid. Fell paused beside it, resting his hand on the box as if greeting an old adversary. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "How much dread can cling to a mere object? Before last night, this little contraption was just another museum oddity, an echo of superstition preserved behind glass. Yet for one night it became the heart of fear itself. The fault was never in the clock, of course. It was in the men who tried to make it speak their own lies." Hadley gave a short nod, lighting his pipe with weary satisfaction. "Well, the thing's finished now. Lorimer will hang, Vale will have his day in court, and the professor, God rest him, can be buried without whispers." Fell shook his head slowly. "Not quite finished, Hadley. You see, justice isn't arithmetic. It doesn't balance neatly once you subtract one villain and add another. Lorimer's rope won't erase the wound that started all this, the corruption, the pride, the hunger for recognition. Those are crimes of the spirit, and they always find new apprentices." I watched him as he spoke, his round face illuminated by the watery dawn. There was something almost melancholy beneath his booming geniality, a sense that he'd seen too many puzzles where the solution only deepened the sadness. Miss Marsh entered then, her black coat drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked pale but composed, her eyes reflecting both grief and a calm acceptance. "Superintendent Hadley told me," she said softly. "It was Dr. Lorimer, wasn't it?" "Yes, my dear," Fell said gently. He twisted Vale's folly into a weapon. It was a performance worthy of the stage, a scholar's mind turned to the ugliest use. She nodded slowly. "I suppose it's some comfort to know the truth, though Uncle Andrew would have hated the spectacle of it all. He always said museums should preserve wonder, not tragedy." Fell's eyes softened. He was right, but perhaps that's what makes his death meaningful. The wonder he loved so much was used to disguise deceit, and now, at least, it's been restored to honesty. Hadley exhaled through his teeth. "Aye, honesty, and about 20 pages of my report. Do you realize, Fell, how devilishly complicated this case has been? Locked rooms, trick windows, whispering air, and murder by pendulum. You make it sound like a riddle fit for bedtime stories." Fell chuckled, the sound low and affectionate. "Then perhaps we've all learned something, my boy. Never trust the silence of a room. Every wall, every hinge, every breeze keeps a record of what it's seen. The trick is learning how to listen." We stood for a while longer in that dim, haunted office. The world outside was brightening. The fog had nearly gone, replaced by a thin gold mist of sunlight breaking across the rooftops. In that shifting light, the room looked less like a tomb and more like what it truly was, a place of knowledge reclaimed from madness. Miss Marsh placed the small box containing the clock fragments into Fell's hands. "Would you like to take it, Doctor? For study, I mean. The museum will close for repairs, and I'd rather it was in safe keeping." Fell regarded it with a wistful expression. "Thank you, but no. Some relics are better left disassembled. The dead have earned their silence." He replaced the box on the desk and turned toward the door, his cane thumping softly on the boards. "Let the whispering clock sleep, Miss Marsh. It's told us everything it can." As we stepped out into the morning air, the bells of street martins began to toll again, clear, unbroken, and human. Hadley tucked his notebook away, looking faintly amused. "You'll be giving another of your lectures about this one, I suppose?" Fell smiled beneath his hat brim. "Perhaps, though the audience always prefers ghosts to mathematics. Still, I may title it The Case of the Whispering Clock. It has a certain ring to it, don't you think?" We descended the steps together, our breath misting in the cool light. Behind us, the museum loomed silent, its windows catching the rising Sunday. And though the city had begun to stir, the rattle of carts, the call of vendors, the hum of London returning to life, I couldn't help glancing back once more. For just a moment, I fancied I heard the faintest echo of a chime, distant and calm, as if time itself were closing the door upon the long, haunted night. We walked back toward Hampstead Heath beneath a pale, washed sky. The city was waking, the hum of milk carts, the rattle of shutters, the smell of coal fires beginning their morning duty, but none of it felt quite real after the long night. Hadley drove in silence, his face set in that familiar mask of satisfaction tinged with unease, the look of a man who has solved his case yet still feels a splinter in the mind. Dr. Fell sat beside him, the brim of his broad hat tilted low, his cloak gathered about him like some ponderous scholar lost in memory. When we reached his house, the familiar comfort of his study, its worn books, its amber firelight, the faint smell of pipe smoke seemed almost surreal after the spectral air of the museum. Yet even here, amid the warmth and solidity of the place, the case lingered like a half-remembered echo. Fell sank into his chair with a grunt of contentment, poured himself a measure of ale, and gestured for us to sit. "Well," Hadley said finally, stretching his arms, "that ties it up neatly enough. Lorimer will hang, Vale will answer for his part, and the world will go on none the wiser. If ever I meet another clock in my life, Fell, I'll have it dismantled on sight." Fell's eyes glimmered with amusement. "Then you'll have destroyed more evidence of human folly than most magistrates. But tell me, Hadley, does the story feel finished to you?" Hadley frowned. "You mean the paperwork?" "Not quite. There's always a report waiting. But as far as the mystery goes, yes, I'd say so." Fell leaned back, exhaling a cloud of smoke that curled upward into the lamplight. "You surprise me. For my part, I always find endings to be the least trustworthy part of any tale. There's always some faint question hiding beneath the applause." I hesitated. "What question, Doctor?" He turned his great, ruddy face toward me, his expression unreadable. Not of guilt, Lorimer was guilty, make no mistake, but of motive. He told us Vale's incompetence would have ruined the museum, yet that was only part of it. I suspect something deeper, a scholar's pride wounded beyond repair. He wanted to control the story of discovery, not merely to save a reputation. When Gillingham exposed the forgery, it wasn't just deceit he threatened to reveal, it was Lorimer's vanity, the very thing he worshipped. Hadley snorted softly. "You make him sound like a Greek tragedy." "Indeed," Fell said. "Pride makes philosophers of the damned. It persuades them that their lies are necessary for truth." He paused, staring into the fire. "That's what I mean about unfinished stories. Every impossible crime hides a very ordinary weakness at its heart." The clock on the mantel ticked with a slow, patient rhythm, and for a while none of us spoke. Outside, the sound of passing footsteps and carriage wheels drifted faintly through the open window. It felt as though London itself were beginning to shake off the night's dream. Then, quite unexpectedly, Fell chuckled a deep, wheezing laugh that startled even Hadley. "You know," he said, "I sometimes wonder whether I'm the last romantic left in this dreary city. Everyone believes in facts and measurements, yet when they meet something that contradicts them, a locked door, a vanished footprint, they turn to ghosts. What they cannot reason, they fear. And what they fear, they worship." Hadley gave a small smile. "And you, Fell?" What do you worship? Fell's answer came slowly, almost gently, the pattern beneath the noise, the music of cause and effect. That's all a detective really is, a man trying to listen to the right melody while everyone else is dancing out of time. He rose then, filling the room with his bulk, and tapped his cane once on the hearthstone. But enough philosophy. There's work to be done. I've a lecture to write, and a world determined to forget its lessons. He glanced at me with a kindly grin. And you, my boy, will make sure this story is told properly, without embellishment, without melodrama, but with just enough mystery to keep them awake at night. Hadley stood, buttoning his coat. You're a strange man, Fell. You spend a night chasing phantoms, and by morning you're quoting philosophy about them. Not phantoms, Fell said, smiling. People. They're far more dangerous. As we left his house, the morning sun was climbing over the rooftops, painting the wet cobbles with gold. The air smelled of rain and coal smoke, alive and ordinary again. Yet as I walked away, I couldn't help glancing back through the mist toward the faint outline of the Ellery house, far off in the square of my imagination. Somewhere within that shuttered building, perhaps beneath a layer of dust and silence, the last fragments of the whispering clock still waited mute now, yet somehow eternal, for in the end, as Fell had said, the dead seldom lie. It's the living who twist their truths into puzzles, hoping time will forget them, but time, like that old clock, has a way of whispering back.